Okay, welcome everybody to another episode of our Ozarks Authors series. My name is Tom Peters. I'm the Dean of Library Services here at Missouri State University. I want to welcome everybody who here is in person and also online. And I do believe we are also recording this session so that future generations will be able to experience this talk this evening. We're in for a treat this evening. So I don't remember when I met Curtis Copeland, but I do know that he's a cartographer by trade and works for the city of Branson and has done some amazing maps. I actually have his map of the White River region hanging on my wall in my office, and he did an amazing map for the Henry Schoolcraft bicentennial that is available online as well. So he just does some amazing maps and also is very interested in the history of the Ozarks. Tom Coob, he doesn't know this, but I first sort of encountered Tom Coob through his writings, his books about the Table Rock Lake, and read it avidly. And I've heard him speak before. I've heard both of these gentlemen speak before. And so without further ado, please welcome Tom Koob and Curtis Copeland.
Thank you, Tom. Good evening. Thanks for coming out tonight. I'm Tom Koob. I'm an outlander, but I've lived in the Ozarks for 30 years, so I like to consider that I have the heart of an Ozark. And Curtis will introduce himself, and he's a true Ozarker, so hopefully we balance out just a little bit. Just before I start, I do want to make an apology. I had cataract surgery on my right eye today, so it's not working at all. So my depth perception is off, and I may actually tear a little bit. So I'm not upset if that happens. It's just a result of the surgery. So thank you. Is there anybody here that is a hillbilly? Oh, all right.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Depends on what we say tonight, I guess. I don't know. How many think that can be a pretty good thing?
Mm-hmm.
How many think sometimes it's used in a kind of a negative sense?
Yes.
Yeah. So can be both, right? That was the kind of the premise for our book, Ozarks Hillbilly. We wanted to find out, where did that name come from? Why is it a stereotype? How did it develop? But what are true Ozarkers like? Maybe true Ozarkers really represent a much more positive, strong characteristic than sometimes that the stereotype often has done. So we're trying to kind of balance that out. And we do it through research and telling stories and giving examples, but also doing a lot of personal interviews with people and telling their true life Ozark stories to say, you know, these were some pretty tough, strong, intelligent, capable people. So is that fella a hillbilly? I mean, from a stereotypical standpoint, kind of looks like it. Looks a little pioneerish, old-fashioned. He's dressed fairly nice, but kind of rustic. He's carrying holding what appears to be a muzzle loader. He's got a powder horn, a little bit of a slouch hat there. So maybe he kind of fulfills that stereotype, but he also seems kind of proud. He's got very good posture. Seems like he's maybe got some stories to tell. I don't know. I just like the picture. This man is Sam McDaniel. We don't know a lot about him. He was a Missouri State representative for 2 terms from McDonald County. We captured this photo from the Vance Randolph collection.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and they were kind enough to allow us to use it. We just like the photo, and we think it tells a little bit of a story. What's the next slide there, Curtis?
So I'll go ahead and introduce myself. Tom Peters gave us a great introduction, and Tom Koob alluded to the fact that I was a real Ozarker. I guess there's a lot of definitions for what that means, but what I can tell you is this topic of our book is means a lot to me, because I've been called a hillbilly both in a positive and a negative way. And but I am proud to be a hillbilly for sure. And I think that terminology, there is a lot of positive aspects to that, and we want to highlight those because, especially outside of our region, that terminology is generally used in a negative fashion. And so, like Tom had mentioned, the real heart of this book, in my opinion, is interviewing actual people and getting their perception on what it is to be a hillbilly. So this is an interesting building here, and I'll let Tom talk a little bit more about it, because he knows Wanda and interviewed Wanda. But this is down by Ponca, Arkansas, on the Buffalo National River area. And it's one of the earliest structures down there, and it has that look and feel and vernacular of that hillbilly stereotype. But Wanda had a really interesting story, and I'll let Tom tell a little bit about that.
Yeah, this is Beaver Jim's Blinds cabin. You can still see it if you go to Ponca. How many been to Ponca? Beautiful place, great place. The low water bridge in Ponca, right on the other side, you walk up the hill, and that's where Beaver Jim's cabin is. There are a lot of blinds in the Ponca area. They've been there since probably the early 1820s. So there's a lot of blinds there. And I know one of them personally. Wanda Donaldson has been a successful real estate agent in the Shell Knob area for many years. I found out was a blinds. And when I found out what her maiden name was, I said, I've got to interview that lady. And she told me some really great stories about growing up in Ponca. And some of these are pretty typical of how people grew up in some of the more isolated areas of the Ozarks. Wanda told me, she said, we never knew we were poor. We lived a good life, and I didn't realize we were any different than anyone else until I went to high school in Harrison. I never heard the word hillbilly growing up, but now I know I am a hillbilly. I'm proud that it means I'm honest. And there goes a tear. It's such a sad story. I'm proud that it means I'm honest, straightforward, and tough. I'm proud of my family and my ancestry. So I think Wanda is a really good example of someone that, I want to read one more thing and maybe just kind of put it in perspective just a little bit. Let me see where it is. I may have lost that one. Well, I don't have it, but the story is, Wanda told me, and I don't want to embarrass her, but she told me this story, and she said, I didn't get my first pair of shoes until I was 9 years old. And she said, I still remember the smell of those shoes that came from the local general store. They smelled like sawdust and turpentine. And it's something about that image that just tells me, on one hand, you think she didn't have shoes until she was 9, but yet she has this pleasant memory of it. And I thought that took a special kind of character to, one, reveal that, and also be kind of proud and consider it a good memory. So that's just the kind of person she is. She's smart, she's tough, she's had a successful career. But she grew up in a pretty tough, poor environment, although a beautiful environment. What do we got?
Yeah, so with the structure of the book, in addition to the interviews, which were so much fun to get a chance to talk to individuals and hear their personal stories, was to design it chronologically and to try to trace back the origins of the term hillbilly and other associated terminology. And the kind of more negative leaning terminology and characterizations of hill folk started on pretty early. And what we see here is a pretty famous Currier and Ives picture of the Arkansas Traveler, which is a folk tale and a folk song. And it's an interesting little story about the interactions of an outlander, an outsider, and his initial interactions with hill folk. And you get it's kind of it's an interesting story, interesting play, and we won't get too far into that. But it really started painting some of those early characterizations of hill folks, and kind of the early influence that I'm most familiar with, and has gotten a lot of press in the last couple of years because of the 200th anniversary of his travels through the Ozarks. I'm talking about Henry Rowe Schoolcraft, and and this has been covered a lot in recent years. But for those who don't know, Henry Rowe Schoolcraft was from the Northeast. He came from a relatively affluent family, well educated, and he came to the Ozarks after kind of a failed attempt at continuing on it with the family business. And his intentions and his interest was geology and minerals and so forth. And Missouri at that time wasn't quite yet a state. It was close, still a territory. And there was a pretty significant mineral operation that had been going on, lead mining and so forth, since the Spanish era, the French era, and even Native Americans utilized lead mining in that area. So he came down to what is now Potosi, and to do some studies, wrote a book about the mining operations in Potosi. And he was basically jockeying for a position, a government job as the nation's geologist, if you will. But he had heard tales and heard stories of a lead deposit down on the James River and the White River Hills. And so, long story short, he decided that he and another individual from out east, Levi Pettibone, both of these guys are in their middle 20s, very green when it comes to knowing anything about the Ozarks or survival, decided that they would go out and seek this lead deposit along the James River, very near, well, basically in the southeast corner of what's today Springfield. So they went 900 miles in about 3 months on foot, and spent most of the time either lost or starving. And what is important about Schoolcraft is he did an amazing job chronicling the Ozarks at that period in time, in 1818, 1819, before any kind of major settlement. But he was encountering these first pioneers, these first settlers on his travels, mainly down around the White River, which would have been their main transportation into the Ozarks, at the mouth of Beaver Creek and along Swan Creek and along the North Fork of the White River. And so Schoolcraft journaled this. He very detailed journal, the flora and fauna and all the geology, of course. And he also took note of the hill people that he encountered. And this has been a reference for 200 years for historians as a keystone of study of Ozarks history and how it has changed over time. The problem is that although there's a number of instances where these hill folk literally saved Schoolcraft and his buddy Levi Pettibone from starvation or worse, he wrote he recorded their stories in a rather negative way. And it's almost like a well-educated individual from out east coming down into the Ozarks and looking down their nose at the hill people, because it's almost like he was comparing himself to them, and what he overlooked was their sense of survival, the way they were able to survive in this environment. But he pointed out what they were dressed. It was deer skins and hides, both men and women. A lack of formal education, obviously. So those are the things he focused on when he really should have focused on their survival skills and how they're able to interact with the Osage, the Native Americans that were the dominant tribe in the Ozarks, a very fearful tribe to many others. And just the way these first settlers were able to eke out an existence in the hills of the Ozarks. So that continues on later on into the 1800s, even a little bit prior to the Civil War and beyond, where you get a lot of outlander journalists talking about the Ozarks and the people within, and creating these characterizations. And most of the time they're humorous stories, and we refer to this group of literary folks as the Southwest journalist, which in this day and age, even myself, I was thinking, wow, Southwest journalists are writing about Arizona and things like that. It sounds more like cowboys and stuff. And but at that time, Missouri, the Missouri Ozarks and the Arkansas Ozarks was the Southwest. It was the frontier of our nation. But you get a lot of those same kind of comical, poke fun characterizations. There are a few examples, kind of like I call it the Jed Clampett, where the hillbilly gets one over on the sophisticated city folk or urban people. But after that, we start to move into the Civil War and Reconstruction era. And the Civil War in the Ozarks was a different kind of war than the rest of the country, especially out east where the big battles were, more of the big formal battles with tens of thousands of soldiers. And you had about 3 or 4 significant battles in the Ozarks, especially early on in the war. But for the most part, because it was out on the frontier, and because of the remoteness and lack of transportation and lack of the ability to support large armies, it was very much a no man's land. Missouri was a border state. Allegiances and alliances were divided, and it got very ugly. There was a lot of guerrilla warfare and bushwhacker type of warfare, folks either fighting unconventional guerrilla tactics for one or the other side, or those that took advantage of the situation with the men off to war, the women, children, and old folks that tried to keep the homesteads alive and going while the men were at war. They preyed upon those folks. And so it was a very sad area to be in during the Civil War, not just in your traditional loss of life through battle, but the civilian situation. And you see a mass exodus of the civilian population. But there's also this imagery that is brought back to by soldiers from their experiences in the Ozarks during the war. And again, this is another more of an outlander point of view. So I want to read a couple of letters from Union soldiers that had spent time in the Ozarks on missions or patrols and whatever. And one of this first letter kind of relates to the Ozarks environment. And a lot of the things that we enjoy about the Ozarks today was a real detriment to them at that time. It says, this soldier states, what shortly before had been considered a mountainous wonderland now was described as a gloomy and forbidding region of chert hills and pine forest, a country of the most weird and uninviting character, an uninhabited, cheerless, and arid region, and the most desolate country I ever saw, crisscrossed by the awfulest roads man ever traveled. So
He's describing the Ozarks.
he is. It sounds a lot different than Branson Chamber of Commerce. And then here's another description, again from a Union soldier, about the hill people they encountered. Quite a number of soldiers remarked that the natives, later generations would derisively call them hillbillies, matched their ramshackle buildings. One man observed that there is a general appearance of slovenliness, as if they had all come to the conclusion that there was no use trying to be decent. So with that, I'll talk real quickly about the bald knobber era, another topic that I feel a little more comfortable talking about because I spent the better of my life with an infatuation about this group, and I learned a lot about this group over the years. And what we see here are the Christian County faction of the bald knobbers, and the bald knobbers actually started in Taney County as a law and orderly, quote unquote. But with further research, we find that it was much more of a political movement than it was with law and order. So what had happened was right after the Civil War, Taney County was a really unique situation. Even with loyalty acts and all of the rules of Reconstruction, Taney County was very much still, all the way up into the 1880s, a very Southern sympathizing county. And it was also broke, very much in debt. There are of the opinions that that was purposeful. That was the way of those in political power of getting back at the Union by bankrupting the county and so forth. But anyway, some of these Union soldiers that were stationed at Ozark, their duty wasn't major battles, but was literally to come on patrols into Taney County and Christian counties from Ozark and to rout out Southern sympathizers and guerrillas. And so a lot of these Union soldiers were very familiar with where are the best bottomlands to farm, where are the existing mills, where are the best assets of Taney County. And also at that time, there was rumors of a railroad coming through, and it was presumed that it would go through Forsyth, and as we know now, it went through Branson, or what would become Branson. So you got, also during this time, you have a major in-migration, and a lot of this is from these ex-Union soldiers. And they saw what they felt was corruption in the county. And so politically, they overturned the 1884 election, I believe, and it went to what was referred to then as radical Republican control for the first time in history. And it has been amazingly enough, a Republican county ever since. And so the major difference in the Taney County bald knobbers was that they didn't wear masks. They didn't want to wear masks. They were, quote unquote, upstanding citizens of Taney County. They were lawyers and bankers and businessmen and real estate folks. And they wanted to be seen. They wanted to say, hey, we're going to make a change. Since the Civil War, there's been 30 murders, legendary, but there'd been 30 murders that had gone untried and unpunished, and we're going to make a change. On the other hand, you have this, the Christian County bald knobbers, which the railroad had come to Chadwick at that point. The purpose for the Chadwick line out of Springfield was to get into the oak specifically the oak, the white oak forests of the Ozarks, rich in timber. They were building railroads across the nation, and this was a point where you could get all the railroad ties that the hills could provide. So the economy before this time was subsistence farming, was trying to stay alive, rock farming. And so you have these subsistence farmers that have this new way of income. If they could hack 8 or 10 ties a day, that was a lot of money for them, at a few cents at a time. But what comes with spendable money but vice? And what better way to get there is to come along on the railroad. So pretty soon you have blind tigers, or a saloon, if you will, gambling, and all the other things that come with it that could take this money away. So in a lot of ways, the Christian County bald knobbers was formed to kind of combat this as a moral police, a morality police. But timbered land was also a very valuable commodity. And so just like in Christian County and Taney County, both prior to the 1880s and the Reconstruction, you had a lot of what was called squatters, folks that would just homestead land and just live there, establish farms and so forth, but not necessarily pay taxes on it. And so this is oftentimes discussed as a way in for the bald knobbers to justify removing characters of undesirable characters and access to that land. Now, a lot of that is kind of speculation, and a lot of it may be more detail about the bald knobbers than you wanted to hear, but I just wanted to bring that up because it helps define another part of this hillbilly image, which is a class-based, from educated and urban to uneducated and rural, and also wealth versus non-wealth. And that's something we can't ignore when we talk about these negative stereotypes.
And to some extent, the town elite, the professionals, the business owners, the lawyers, the politicians, versus the country poor, who were the people that were living out subsistence farming or small farms. So there's a little bit of a, even though they're all Ozarkers, a little bit of a contradiction there.
Mm-hmm. So then I'm gonna let Tom, because you're probably tired of hearing me, I'll let Tom talk a little bit about Romanticism and country life.
So we have these sources for some negative stereotypes. The early chroniclers weren't particularly kind. The Southwestern humorists weren't. They were trying to be funny, but they often could be critical. But right around the beginning of the 20th century, a kind of a new movement developed, probably partially as a result of growth of the cities, industrialization. A lot of people came to start thinking that there's a lot of bad things going on in the big cities. Maybe there's some really positive things about more rural areas. And that's where a lot of our produce comes from. And maybe we ought to try to help these people, or at least respect them a little bit more. And out of some of that type of thinking, developed Romanticism in a lot of the writing. And we get books like this one here, which everybody knows about, which one of the most popular novels ever written in America, it's my understanding. When you read it today, it's a very romanticized style. Maybe it seems a little old-fashioned. Harold Bell Wright was criticized for his writing ability, but it was sure as heck a very popular book, and it brought a lot of interest to the Ozarks. And he was, for the most part, pretty kind to the people. You know, when you read a description of Sam Elaine or the
Young Matt,
yeah, they're pretty positive images. Maybe a little over the top sometimes, but pretty positive. And it's nice that perhaps he was beginning to present, yeah, there's some positive characteristics out there too. So that helped spread a more positive image. At the same time, there was national interest in something called the country life movement. In fact, Teddy Roosevelt established a commission called the Country Life Commission to investigate what we need to do to help the poor country people. So it was, I'm sure some local people probably thought, yeah, the federal government's going to come in and they're going to fix everything for it. So I'm not so sure that it was always worked so well, but at least it indicated that there was some recognition that there were some positive attitudes about a more rural or country style of life, and that it was worth at least looking at and trying to recognize that. What's our next slide there?
So,
yeah. Who's this?
Vance Randolph, yeah. So so we move a little bit more along the timeline here. Shepherd of the Hills has been out for a good decade or so, and you have this gentleman come out on the scene, and one thing about I find really interesting is that the Ozarks, and I don't want to segue too much or digress too much, but there is something really, I don't know, for lack of a better term, magical about the Ozarks, because, you know, how is it exceptional from other rural cultures or other rural regions? And I don't know that it really is, I mean, from a physical standpoint, but there's something about it that really gets into people's blood. And it's really evident about the people that are originally outlanders, if you will. And I always struggle with that. What is that barometer? You know, because most of us are outlanders at one point or other. But anyway, you know, Vance Randolph, Otto Rayburn, all these people that have done tremendous study that we all rely all of us that have a passion for the Ozarks rely so much on the work of these folks. And they're, you know, from Kansas and Iowa and places outside the Ozarks, and they came here and they devoted their life to it. I mean, literally devoted their life to it. And but to get back to our discussion here, sorry about that. So Vance Randolph and Otto Rayburn and May Kennedy McCord and folks like that, they helped to reinforce this romanticized or this positive look at a caricature of hillbillies, but they still focused on what would become the stereotype. Vance was he specifically sought out the very rural folks versus the Ozarks town people. Not to say that he didn't collect a lot of information from town people, but he liked to tell his stories, and he liked to write about the rural folks, and especially the eccentricities and the odd things about them. And he was a writer by trade, and he knew that was of interest to the other Outlanders. That was, I call it the hee-haw effect. It's a hee-haw in the 70s was amazingly popular, especially in the urban areas. And I like to think it's just because of that unique, bizarre hillbilly lifestyle. And I think early on, Vance recognized that, and he said, he was trying to make a living. And so the byproduct of that is he created and perpetuated that interest in that single segment of the overall Ozarks population. Even in the early and mid 20th century, when Vance was active, there was a lot of very modern things happening. Springfield was a very modern metropolitan area. The highways were starting to come in, railroads were coming in, but Vance was still pulling his stories out of the deepest, darkest depths of the hills.
And he pulled a lot of stories.
He did. And then Mary Elizabeth Mankey. So she was a generational Ozarker. Her father was the second in charge of the Taney County Bald Knobbers. And I'd say just a single generation, because they came in from Indiana after the war. But Mary Elizabeth was an amazing chronicler, and she was a wonderful writer. She's a poet laureate. But she got her start because, again, her father, Alonzo, being one of those upstanding Taney County Bald Knobbers, he was an attorney. He was a number of things. He helped start University of Arkansas, of all things, but he's also a newspaper guy. And so at a very young age, Mary Elizabeth asked to write for the newspaper, and he gave her that opportunity. And she spent a lifetime being what I call like a community or a country correspondent. And Mary Elizabeth and her family, as a child, they were kind of a nomadic family. But also later in life, when she married C.P. Mankey, they were very nomadic as well, for a number of reasons. But she got to spend a lot of time in different communities in the Ozarks, and she was always writing about that rural lifestyle, that wonderful, simplistic, but very rugged and survivalistic type of lifestyle. And she also had some of those other traits that fortified what Randolph was reporting about, the superstitious nature of the hill people. Mary Elizabeth was a firm believer in a lot of superstitions, and she got national notoriety for her poetry and her newspaper columns and so forth. And so therefore, a lot of folks were exposed to her image, which was a very realistic and true image of the Ozarks. But once again, it's that rural hill culture segment of the overall Ozarks population. So,
could I maybe read one of her poems?
Yeah,
real
please
quickly?
do. Yeah.
I love Mary Elizabeth Mankey's work. Her poems are simple, very straightforward, but they speak to me, and I'd like to read just one. It's called Service. When they put away my silken scarf, my beads and thin worn rings, will they think of my old wash tub, my broom and other things, the little hoe I kept for flowers, the basket 4 dead leaves. No one will use them anymore, and so my spirit grieves. So very simple about her simple life, a little melancholy perhaps, but a wonderful woman and great writing. So I think she's an excellent example of a positive Ozarker.
Do you think we have time to mention Otto Rayburn?
I don't know,
Or we
what
get
time is it?
a little long-winded, but
Now we probably, no, we probably better move around, unless you had something real specific.
no, not too specific.
Yeah.
Not too specific. I'll let you
Alright.
talk about Made in the Ozarks, though.
Oh, boy.
So we're
Well-
moving up in time a little bit, right?
Yeah, a little bit. I mentioned that right around the turn of the century, there was some interest in the Romanticism and the country life, a more positive image, but it's right around also the same time, early 1900, movies come along, and a lot of the early movies were hillbilly type movies, and they were awful. And there was a lot of them. And I guess people liked them because they produced a slew of them. And I mean, this is even before talkies. So, there's old silent film reels and stuff. And this continued, and there was all kinds of bad stuff. This is a play, a stage play, made in the Ozarks. I think it was, forget the exact date. I think it was right around 1949, maybe early 50s. It was very popular, produced all over the country, considered by some critics to be the worst play ever produced. But boy, was it popular. And I'm not going to go into the details, but if there's anything negative that wants to be portrayed, it's in this one. So we'll move on from that one.
Yeah. So let's talk about something positive.
That's much more
Yeah.
positive.
Do you want to talk about May?
I can. Yeah,
Okay.
you probably know a little more than me, and I think everybody's probably heard of May Kennedy McCord. Lived quite a while in Springfield. I think originally an Outlander, born in Carthage, maybe.
Mm-hmm. But grew up in Galena. Yeah.
Grew up in Galena. Married a McCord, who's a well-known family in the James River area. Came to Springfield. Loved to play her old black guitar. Loved to play the old songs. Some of her traditional type Ozark songs are recorded. She also is very well known for her Hillbilly Heartbeats, which was both a newspaper article in the Springfield papers for quite a while, and I think she did a radio show that was very similar to that. She like Mary Elizabeth, she liked to talk about real life, what it was like to be an Ozark woman, what country people were really like. She told it straightforward and like it was. She solicited information from her readers and her listeners and told their stories. She was very instrumental in supporting some of the early music festivals and Ozark folk fairs in the area.
Yeah.
So really, in a lot of different ways, presented in what I think is an accurate, positive portrayal of Ozarkians. And she didn't mind calling herself a hillbilly. She was very proud of it. And she said that more than once, I'm sure. So I think Mary Elizabeth is a great example of a true Ozarker and what we would like to say is a good positive image.
Yeah, definitely a positive image. There's a book coming out. I probably let you talk about that a little bit later, but I'm really looking forward to a book about May Kennedy McCord. But what I find fascinating about her, what I really like about May, of what I know of her, is just a real good old-fashioned spunk. She's not afraid to defend the hillbilly image tooth and nail. She came to Vance Randolph's defense a number of times. Vance found his way. He got crossways with the Ozarks boosters, those trying to drive economic development and modernization through whether it be the Springfield Chamber of Commerce or other things. They saw Vance as a perpetuator of this negative backwoods hillbilly image. And May would jump to his defense, either in newspaper, print, or otherwise. But the other neat thing, too, if you ever have an opportunity to listen to some of her radio recordings, it's no wonder she was so popular with people all over the United States, because it's just like sitting down with grandma and listening to grandma's stories. And the way she presented completely had to be unscripted to a degree, just very free flowing, just like having a chat with grandma, and it's wonderful. So if you ever get a chance to hear them, it's a wonderful thing, and it's timeless. I mean, it's the same type of grandma thing that's goes through the ages, but she's very positive hillbilly image and a defender of it, a huge cheerleader for the hillbilly. So speaking of hillbillies, you want to talk about these fellers?
Yeah, the music business, that's a big subject to take on, but we try to do it from a hillbilly standpoint. In the 1920s, record producers kind of started getting interested in what they considered country music. Sometimes it was called race music. And they were out scouting around in the South and some in the Ozarks looking for talented traditional musicians. OK Records was one of the first to really kind of develop that genre and published music. They found these fellers in Virginia and recorded them. And during the recording session, Ralph Peer, who was running the studio, asked them what their name was, and their reply was, "We don't have a name. We're just a bunch of the hillbillies from the hills of Virginia." And the name kind of stuck, and they used it on their record label. And if you look at this picture, do we have the other picture? I think we just have the one.
Just the one.
Yeah, the one. But in the book, there's two pictures. There's this picture, which shows them in kind of a typical, stereotypical presentation. You know, looks like they're singing. Looks like that's a violin, probably. You know, they got the overalls on, the slouchy hats. A little bit of a negative stereotypical image. But there was, at the same time, and some of the other published music that they did, they're very well dressed in suits, and then one is sitting at a piano, and they look very professional, and it's a much different image. And I think they just didn't know what to do with these fellows. They didn't know what to do with this type of music. You know, was it country music, traditional music? What was it? And it just kind of got all mishmashed and all this different stuff. Of course, at the same time now, if you want to try to describe what is traditional Ozark music, boy, it's really hard to do. You know, you can say, well, it's got to be a song that came from Scotland or Ireland or England, and they knew about it 400 or 500 years ago. Yeah, I think that probably makes it traditional, and it comes over here, and it gets in the Appalachians, and goes to Kentucky, and eventually it comes into the Ozarks, and they're still singing Barbary Allen, and they all say, "I only sing Barbary Allen the way that it's supposed to be sung. Anybody else that does it different don't know what they're doing." Everybody says that, and they're all different, of course. So, is Barbary Allen a traditional song? Yeah, it sure as heck is, and it could be a traditional Ozark song. Well, I think it probably is, but you know, you get all these influences from, you listen to other people, and then you hear you know, the Victrola, and then you hear the radio, and then you hear the television, and then you go to a concert, and all these versions really get mashed up. So it's really hard to decide what's true traditional. But whatever the definition is, country music became really popular. And along with that, sometimes they would call it hillbilly, although the Grand Ole Opry never did. You were not to ever call this hillbilly music. Is not allowed. Others, country singers, embrace that. But in the end, I think not only was a lot of the music simple, but good, some of it traditional. What started coming along with some of this hillbilly music was the comedy. The addition of, there's always got to be this comic, you know, banter. Then there becomes, well, there's this person that comes out on stage and they're dressed sloppily and silly and they're missing half their teeth and they tell stupid scatological jokes. And boy, it seemed to stick, and it was popular. A lot of people do it, a lot of people still do it. It is a comic image, you know. Okay, comedy's fine, humor's fine. But boys sure seem to stick to that hillbilly image for some reason.
Which is a good segue kind of into the Weaver
Yeah,
brothers.
some
Yeah,
local
they're-
folks that did pretty well with it, I'd say.
Yeah, absolutely. I think our biggest fans right here, right? So, but
Woohoo!
yeah, they were masters of. I mean, they were masters of
They
that.
were good at it.
You know, where they kind of bring successful elements of vaudeville, and they made the image theirs, and they were very successful with it. And
Now, Elvira was married to both of them, right?
right.
Not at the same time.
Sequential.
Sequentially, yep. And they're also from here local in Ozark, Missouri. But I didn't want to cut in on your talk about the Weaver brothers,
No,
but
they were local. They did really well. They did stage shows all over the world. I think they may have did one for the Queen of England at one point,
Yeah.
Carnegie Hall possibly. They were good at what they did, and they presented a fairly fresh, clean style of music. They mixed in some simple dancing. They had some, okay costumes, a little silly, but probably appropriate. And they had this humor, particularly with Elvira, this kind of banter back and forth, and you're never quite sure if she's getting one up on you or not. A little bit shrewish sometimes, but it was very popular. And of course, beyond that, like I said, this comic figure in country music just continued up to the present day, that it seems to be there. And I have to say, sometimes it's pretty funny and it's entertaining. I think you just have to be careful about, why is that silly, sometimes over the top comic feature always seem to be attached to this hillbilly country traditional music, whatever it is. But they did a good job with it.
mhm.
Some of their movies were a little questionable. Yeah, in the movie industry, not the best examples. Oh
So,
boy,
yeah. So
more local folks.
more local folks. So you all have seen these types of calendars and postcards for years in gift stores all over the Ozarks.
Still out there, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, they're selling them on the racks at Shepherd of the Hills still. Just saw them just a couple weeks ago. So this is a hillbilly image that I grew up with. I remember seeing this in the card racks and everything. And these are actually, or at least the patriarch of the family. This is the Seaton family from down Stone County, Cape Fear area, as what I would call an intentional hillbilly. So Bruce Seaton, the father of the crew, he was
And that's Bruce right there.
yep, there's Bruce there,
And that's Dorothy.
and I'll explain that photo in just a minute. But Bruce and Dorothy, Bruce was he was an educated guy, like college educated guy, had worked on for a number of agricultural, like very scientific agricultural industries and so forth. But he was a very much an entrepreneurial spirit, and his family was from near the around the Stone County area, and he met Dorothy, and they brought in a group of kids together when they got married. In fact, Dorothy is the one who taught me how to square dance at Shepherd of the Hills. So Bruce and Dorothy came along in the Shepherd of the Hills play very, very early. We're talking in the middle to late 60s, kind of the apex of when everything started to kind of blossom down there with Silver Dollar City and Table Rock Lake and Shepherd of the Hills. And so again, Bruce, he brought the family to the Cape Fear area. And what you see here is not this domicile here is not a prop. That was their home.
They live there.
They lived there for 9 years, and they would each year, it started with the dirt floor. Each year they would put in another segment of concrete, and after about 8 years they had a full concrete floor. The kids had to newspaper and tar paper the insulation before every winter. They raised their own hogs, scalded and butchered their own hogs. And so they were living the real deal. They were living that lifestyle. So that in a way adds their credibility. But as far as this hillbilly image here, they're really living that way. But the interesting thing about it is this was a business venture. So Bruce worked at the Stone County newspaper for Leon Fredericks, who said, "Hey, there's an opportunity at this new place called Silver Dollar City, and I've got this antique printing press that's from a barn down in Blue Eye. Let's haul that thing down there, and let's set up a bookstore and printing press, and we'll print wanted posters and different things. How would you like to do that?" And Bruce jumped at it, and so he would dress up in the kind of an old time printer. And then a little later on, they used to print a daily newspaper, and I think they still do, but not in the same fashion. They literally pressed them, and for events happening throughout the day in the city, and they sold them like on the corner and in the shop. And Bruce brought his kids out to sell newspapers, 10 cents a paper, and for every paper they got to keep a penny. And Bruce dressed them up in these shabby clothes and so forth to look like the trying to think of like an old 1800s industrial area newspaper boy on the corner of New York City, that kind of look, not necessarily a hillbilly. So they all got together one day there at the bookshop, and another employee said, "Hey, if these would make a great postcard, this is this hillbilly image." So that the lights came on for Bruce, and he made a business out of this. So there's a few things. He had a formula. So all of these were staged by Bruce. Each of the children had a specific part.
They're all family members.
They all had to be family members. And the only way that a non-family member could get in a picture was to marry in. So, but each kid had a role. And so one of them always had the dog. One of them was always eating a sandwich or something. One of them always had a shotgun. The guy we interviewed, Steve, he was the one that always had the kid that always had the shotgun. But the image was that the daughters and the mother were always doing all the hard work. And all the men folk were laying around and getting drunk on moonshine or so forth and so on. But there's just hilarious stories about, it must have been so much fun to set these things up. You'll see pictures with cats up on the roof. They tied the cat's paw down, but they put food up there for him. And this particular one, so Dorothy, again, she taught me how to square dance at Shepherd of the Hills. She's about this tall, or was about this tall. She's passed away a couple years ago. She spent over 40 years at Shepherd doing the square dance scene every night. And she's about this tall. So what they did is Bruce built, he put a fence post up and put a 2x4 across the top. He's laying across that.
On the fence.
Yeah, so
Which is in front of her.
Yeah.
So he's laying on the wooden support.
Right.
Of course, he got the jug too.
But this hillbilly image that they did was a financial success, and it also gained a huge audience. Paul Harvey wanted to find out if there really was a Seton family from the Ozarks, the Seton family hillbilly calendars and postcards. That's what Bruce painted on the side of his van when he would drive around and distribute these postcards. And so he found out that they were real people, and Bruce was interviewed by Paul Harvey, and they became close friends. I mean, so you got this national image, once again, reinforced by this extreme rural poverty image of the hillbillies. But there's just one of my favorite parts of the book is talking about the Seton family, a really neat deal.
I think maybe we ought to start thinking about
wrapping up.
Yeah,
Yep.
I'm not sure what we've got left on the
I
slide.
think that's about it. We got the Mabes and
yeah, Mabe's another good entertainment story. A lot of them still around. Probably the group that really initially started at what you might call the Branson sound, and that Branson image with a mix of music and the comic image. which is still used. But great folks and a lot of history there. I don't know what. Yeah. And there we
So
are.
this is kind of where we wrap up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So just a few of the items that we tried to research and find out, where did this come from? Where did the image develop? What are the negative images? What are the positive images? We did do a lot of personal interviews with people, which really helps, I think, give it some, put it to life. At least it does for me. And try to represent a balance, but also a good positive image, so that we all know this negative stereotype image is out there. It's all over the place, still is. Can we balance that a little bit more with what we think is a more truer, positive image? So that was our intent. I hope we've done it. At the same time, made it kind of interesting and give some history of the area. Thank you very much for coming out tonight. We've enjoyed it, and thank you again. Any questions?
Yes.
In the book, you expressed a fondness for your memories of Dog Patch.
Yes.
When it was, the amusement park.
Mm.
I wonder what you think of the prospects of what it's going to become.
Oh.
It really hasn't been.
Oh, Mike.
Be careful.
That was a hard ball right there, buddy.
You asked.
Yeah. Well,
You don't have to answer. We'll talk about it later.
can I say let me express my hopes,
All right.
okay?
Yeah.
I know that it won't be the dog patch that I knew.
No.
There's no way. I hope that it retains at least some of the buildings, some of the vernacular. A lot of those log cabins and homesteads, they were brought in from around the Buffalo River Valley. They were authentic. From my preservationist heart, I hope to see that. I hope that I hope that there is a focus on the natural. I feel confident that it will be. I'm super confident that it will be an Ozarks nature that's accessible to everybody as far as mobility and physically, which I think is great. I know that we all can't do my favorite, to traipse on into the Mark Twain forest and stumble over rocks and ledges. I think it's great that people of all physical capabilities are able to experience that. I think they do a nice job with that in other developments. I hope that it is financially feasible for everybody who loves the Ozarks is really my hope. That it doesn't get overly commercialized and it's accessible to folks of all economic stature, because the Ozarks is, and I don't have cataract surgery, so these might be real tears, but the Ozarks is such a special place. I don't think it should ever be financially inhibited, So thanks for the hardball question,
Well,
Mike.
excellent answer.
Yeah.
There is a short section about Dog Patch,
Yeah.
brief history of it in the book.
But haven't all the buildings just deteriorated? I mean, it's been.
Quite a bit.
Yeah, it is sad. There really needs to, that'd be a great book topic, and it'd be probably a lot of controversy and stuff, but it's so interesting. They tried to make a snow ski resort out of it, and timeshare, and a number of different things. You started out as a trout farm, and so just trying to trace ownership is like a mystery novel. I mean, it'd be a great book if somebody wanted to tackle that.
There's a pretty good YouTube video about
Yeah.
the history of Dog Patch, and it's got quite a few nice videos and photos. It does a pretty good job of telling the story, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
It's about a half hour or something like that.
Anybody? Yeah.
I can't remember, did you talk about Myrtle Mannion at all? And, how does she fit into the hillbilly image? She, in my mind, they didn't reject modernity, they just never modernized that family. And so they were living a very simple life. She was educated, she went here, went to SMS. but they didn't have electricity. They had to sort of force her to put in a phone line.
Yeah.
You know,
Do you have an opinion on that?
Who is it?
Merv Mannion.
Bertle Mannion, the Mannion family.
I don't know. I don't know. I'm
Well,
sorry.
my thought is I think it's you know, I think it's a comfort zone thing, in my opinion. Intentional hillbilly, yeah. Intentional culture, yeah. But I think it's also a comfort thing. It's a familiarity. You know, it's like going to mom's farm. You know, the thing was built in the 40s, and there are modernizations, but it's still rustic and it feels good.
Yeah.
You know, it's like the Ozarks land itself. You know, you know, if you're in a good situation in life, you're not a Union soldier far from home. It's a beautiful, and it gives you a big hug. You know, the hills and valleys, and I think in their situation, in my opinion, it was a comfort thing. You know, but yeah, go ahead.
Was the majority of those people migrated in from Kentucky, Tennessee,
Mm-hmm.
before the war or after the war?
Well,
Both. I'd
both
say.
really. So there was, so after, you know, specifically after statehood, you know, in 1821, you start to get a major influx, and it's interesting. I think this is an interesting trait of hill folks, and I think there's us in the room that have the same traits, and there's all different types of people. But I think one of those things is when I think about people that migrated in the 1800s from Appalachia to the Ozarks to get away and have their own space and not be overruled or anything like that, and to be able to work, I mean, really bust your back to try and survive, just to have your own freedom and space. And the remoteness of Appalachia in the 1800s, I mean, these people really wanted to be away, because the 1800s Appalachia had to be really remote to our
Yeah,
standpoint.
you wonder what they had to gain, although it probably was similar geography.
Right,
They kind of felt comfortable.
exactly.
Yeah,
They
it
knew,
looked kind of like what they'd had before.
they knew how to make a living out of that type of landscape.
We even trace some of that back to the Scotch Irish, and there is definitely a strong Scotch Irish tradition in the Ozarks. There's a lot of other traditions too, but that's a strong one. When we trace it back to, well, you know, if you look at portions of Scotland and Northern Ireland and Northern England, there's some similarities to the Ozarks.
Yeah.
You know, it's verdant, forest, hilly, rocky. So
Didn't
Yeah,
have
the other
comfort level there.
The other draw too, all the way up into about the 1970s, was cheap land. You know,
Yeah.
the Ozarks remained remote far past westward expansion.
Wasn't that
It
arable land?
it wasn't
but it was generally cheap.
It wasn't desirable for large farming.
Well, did moonshine get promoted in the Ozarks back when these folks came over from? They bring their stills with them.
Well, they definitely brought the techniques and the skills to do it. Yeah,
I mean, they made money. I
yeah.
think.
I would argue that you could talk about any area in this country, probably the world, and you're going to find out, are people bringing some method of alcohol, making alcohol
Yeah.
with them? They all are.
Yeah. But
Does it get a lot of attention in the Ozarks? Yes,
Yeah.
it does.
Supplemented their income.
yeah, absolutely. Well, you know, there were government stills in Taney County, so legitimate, you know, tax generating stills, and you know, bringing in corn and being harvested, and so. But you know, for the hill folks, you know, there was medicinal use, obviously, and there was recreational use, obviously, and it was obviously an income source.
Well,
But
it was a use of grain. It was a better way to make money out of your grain instead of having to haul it to the grist mill.
Right,
So there is an economic factor.
Oh,
It's cultural, but it's economic.
Make
It
too.
was
a lot
a
more
great way to monetize,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Exactly.
and the, you know, so much of the Ozarks culture is dominated by the landscape itself. So the Ozarks is remote. It's easy to hide in. It's been an outlaw sanctuary for years. And if it wasn't moonshine in the 1800s and through Prohibition, then you get marijuana in the national forest in the 60s and 70s. And then unfortunately you get methamphetamine. I mean, it's a place to hide, you know, and it's not all parts of every culture are positive, but it's definitely a part of our culture. So anyway,
Let's thank Tom and Curtis again. I believe they had brought in some copies of their book
yeah.
that they're gonna sell if you wanna buy.
Mhm.
And,
If anyone's interested.
I wanna buy one, buy a copy, so, they have those, they'll maybe even sign them, you know? If you ask for them.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.